It's a good morning to you. Welcome to Asake Online. My name is Zenzele Ndebele, and this is the Breakfast Club. Today in our program, we are joined by the ERC, Election Resource Center, and we'll be talking about a policy brief that they are launching. It's focusing on the state of media vis-a-vis the elections in Zimbabwe. You know, every year when we have elections, we always talk about how the media is covering the elections. We always talk about, what the observers say, and the observers most of the times have always said our media is not objective, especially when you're looking at public media. Sometimes some people call it public media, sometimes they call it state media. I hope we have Thabani here who's going to be telling us what we have in Zimbabwe. Do we have state media or public media? So to help me discuss this interesting and important issue as well, I have Thabani Moyo, who's the director for MISA Zimbabwe, and I also have Julian, who is an ERC body, who's also a lawyer by profession. Ladies and gentlemen, lawyer by profession.
Thank you very much, Zenzele, and good morning to you.
Yes, maybe I'll start with you. Yes, maybe before we just go on, I would like you to, if there's someone with a second device that is on, you can just reduce the volume so that we avoid the feedback. Maybe back to the program. Julian, I'll start with you. Can you just briefly tell us why is this policy brief? Why was it written? Why is it important?
I'll just give you a bit of background to give the full reason for why the policy brief was then established. In the 2013 and 2018 general elections, all the observer missions that were accredited to cover the elections in Zimbabwe converged on the state of the media in Zimbabwe during elections. And the observations, for example, by the African Union in 2013 were on 5 key strategic areas, which Zimbabwe to this date still grapples with. And the 5 are namely the need for alignment of the media laws with the Constitution, partisan reporting by the public broadcaster and state media, liberalization of radio and television ownership, safety and security of journalists, and the last one is the dual accreditation of journalists. So the same findings were also echoed by the Commonwealth Election Observer Mission, also by the SADC Election Observer Mission, the SADC Parliamentary Forum Election Observation Mission, the ECF SADC, the COMESA election. So many election observation missions, including the European Union election and the Carter Center for Election Observation Mission and Joint International Observation Delegation of IRI and the NDI in the 2018 general election. So there's a notable challenge that through the regional and international observation mission highlighted media-related challenges. And the government of Zimbabwe has not come up with a roadmap or a public strategy towards addressing these 5 key challenges that have been recurrent in every election. So 2013, we had the same thing. 2018, we've had the same thing. And till this date, not much inroad has been made in overcoming the challenges that have been made. And it is therefore within the scope of this policy brief that we want to examine these variables and how they impact on the holding of a credible general election in 2023. This is vis-a-vis how the media regulatory environment impacts media access and coverage of this exercise. The policy brief, therefore, is to provide recommendations and policy options for the Electoral Commission, the media regulatory body, the government, the regional, and the international community, who are all stakeholders insofar as reaching credible election is made. So it is in that context that we have then established this policy.
Yeah, you're mentioning quite a number of important issues, when it comes to elections and the media. And getting back to you, Thabani, one of the things that we have seen the new government, or not so new, but the so-called Second Republic talking about was, we are coming in, we are repealing IPA, we are making sure that the environment is quite conducive for journalists. Starting there, do we see any change post the Mugabe era when it comes to media in Zimbabwe?
Thanks very much, Zenzele, and also to link it up to Julian's highlight that if you want to measure if there has been change, we want to use what Julian has highlighted as the 5 strategic recommendations from the previous observer missions, specifically the SADC and AU 5 key issues, which has been recurrent, as already highlighted. If you talk of alignment of the law, well, we start with IPA, Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which to this end is partially repealed by the Freedom of Information Act. What this means is that IPA stood on 3 strategic legs. The first one being access, regulation, and privacy. In as far as we are concerned so far, access has been dealt with the Freedom of Information Act, but we still have a gap in terms of regulation, wherein the ZMC bill is before Parliament, and Parliament has proposed that we have another sub-bill that will be attached to the regulatory one, which is the Media Practitioners Bill. Further, we still have a vacuum in terms of privacy. As you could see that the ministry is still to introduce a privacy bill, but the Ministry of ICTs through the Cyber Security and Data Protection Bill have attempted to present a bit of data protection to it. So in a nutshell, repealing of IPA is incomplete and it has left gaps in terms of our laws. Then the other law that was mentioned in the recommendations was the Broadcasting Services Act. This one is even still to come to Parliament. As far as we know, there was a draft which the ministry came up with, which was a bit even more draconian compared to the current one in terms of the proposals. And when we pushed it back, the government took it under the carpet. And since then, to this day, the government seems to be regulating the industry through statutory instruments and ducking parliamentary legislation. So as you might know, we are now a country of statutory instruments. Last year alone, we had almost 294 statutory instruments, which means that we had a statutory instrument a day in terms of regulations, which convolutes our predictability as a country. So in terms of that alignment process, that's where we are. In terms of partisan reporting of the state broadcaster, you can see the behavior of the ZBC. You can see the behavior of state-owned newspapers through the likes of Chronicle, through the likes of Herald, the Sunday News, the Sunday Mail, which are owned by Zim papers. And that's why you saw that there are people who are now challenging, calling for the reconstitution of the Zimbabwe Mass Media Trust, as you read in the press some time ago, on the need for these institutions to become public, to transform from being state-owned entities to being public service entities. The third component, the liberalization of the airwaves. You have seen that the government, through statutory instruments, again, has called for applications, specifically others deemed licensed, such as campus radio stations. Then there's the issue of community radio stations, whereby 10 have been called. 10 which are prescribed in a shocking turn of events. You had districts being named in a call for applications. So if you are not from Cholocho, for example, you can't apply for community radio stations. If you are not from Shamva, you can't apply. So this is quite discriminatory in terms of the call, and goes to the traditional definition of a community radio rather than being an open process. And then the commercial radio stations. This is where the tricky is. Where in the recommendation says there's need for liberalization of ownership, you are seeing a process whereby ownership is being consolidated to those who are in the ruling elite within the broadcasting service. This is deliberate. It's to deal with that recommendation so that in the next election, a facade of opening in the broadcasting services will be presented. The fourth component being that of safety and security of journalists. You are seeing what's happening in terms of our media industry. Only yesterday, Chingono was arrested, and since the beginning of the lockdown, we recorded 33 cases of arrests, harassments, assaults. So this is quite a rather shocking type of record to have in a country that came to power on the promise of breaking with the past. Then the last component, dual accreditation. You see in an election period as provided by statutory instrument 33 of 2008, once an election is called for, ZMC loses control of the media regulation. It goes to ZEC. So if you were registered under ZMC, for example, freelance journalists might pay something like 10 US to register for a year. But now if an election is called or a by-election is called in between, you now need to register with the ZEC. You need to pay the same fee again. But these are two constitutional commissions. This might seem like it's a fair fee for local journalists. But look at international journalists. For a foreign journalist to come here, they need accreditation of 200 US through ZEC. If they are coming for an election season, then they will need to pay the same. If it is a media house, international media house, it needs to pay 10,000 US dollars. If it is an election system, they multiply by 2. So these are two constitutional bodies that are equally double taxing in terms of their roles and regulation. So the general view is that once you are registered with the Zimbabwe election, with the Zimbabwe Media Commission, once an election is called for, you must be deemed licensed and only pay administrative fees like production of your cards and etc., rather than dual taxation. So these are the the 5 issues. Are we changing? As you can see, there's little show to the direction of change compared to stagnation.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue of dual accreditation and many other issues that we're going to try and look at. But look at, for example, just a week or so ago, the president was here, in Bulawayo. He was supposed to meet the chiefs. And using the COVID, we were told that, we then saw a list of names circulating that the following journalists would report to State House for whatever function. Unfortunately, we cannot call everyone because of COVID restrictions. And if you look at that list, it's the journalists that are aligned to the state and the media houses that are aligned to the state. So you know that the likes of Zenzele will be nowhere near State House. And now COVID has been used to actually make sure that journalists don't have access to information. Why do we need a list for journalists to go and cover the president? When you're a journalist, you need to have access to all forms of information.
It is actually a problem, Zenzele, and it's not lawful in any way in terms of the current laws. What we are seeing are extra regulatory measures. As you would also appreciate that in the lockdown period, many issues became locked down as well, including adherence to the laws. In this instance, if you have an accreditation card by the Zimbabwe Media Commission, you have access to public places. And it is not the duty of state security agencies to seek to re-accredit already accredited journalists. What they need to do if they've got a problem is to check with the Zimbabwe Media Commission. If a journalist appears at State House and the numbers, what they must do is just to say, we have this function, we only allow 30 journalists, first come, first serve. Those that will come early will gain accreditation, rather to profile in a security manner and start randomly selecting those that they feel deserve a better place on the higher table. It's quite uncalled for. It's unfortunate because the media in Zimbabwe has beared the brunt of attacks, of segregation, of profiling. To this end, basing on the promise that the president made when he came to power, that is breaking with the past. We want the media to enjoy unfettered access to sources of news. When you then use the restrictions of COVID to quarantine who comes in and who doesn't, it's uncalled for, it's unfortunate. And our call is that this will not remain a trend because definitely it's violating the laws. And as media lobby and advocacy groups, we can't continue to watch this happening without taking necessary steps. So we hope that the country will adhere to the constitutional provisions. Otherwise, we'll need the assistance in terms of interpreting this law and ensure that journalists are not discriminated from accessing public bodies. This will then proceed to hinder the management of elections. If it is happening now, be assured that towards elections, it will be even more difficult for journalists to access public spaces. And we want to use this as a typical example and to start to attend to these environmental factors.
Yeah, Julian, coming back to you, I mean, the last point that Thabani has mentioned actually goes along with what you said at the beginning, that looking at the 2013 and the 2018 elections, there were recommendations that were done by the observer missions, and these recommendations were not implemented. We still have the same issues that we are having. So we are going to have 2 years' time, which is not far, we'll be having another election. As ERC, what kind of plans do you have to actually saying we want to make sure that by the time we get to the next election, these issues have been resolved?
All right, thank you for that question, Zenzele. We do have some policy options that we recommend as a means of ensuring that in 2023 we have credible elections, ones which then deal with the 5 challenges which have been indicated. So for us, we say that Zimbabwe must not miss an opportunity to make the legislative framework conform to the constitution and other regional and international instruments that the country is a signatory to. Imperatively, we're saying ZEC should take the lead in enforcing the constitutional provisions on access to state media by all political contestants and ethical reporting, which also ties in with what Thabani has just indicated on in terms of journalism. These are provided for in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Banjul Declaration on the Principles of Freedom of Expression in Africa, Southern Africa Protocol on Sport, Culture and Information, and the African Charter on Broadcasting. So in the absence of the said reforms, the SADC guidelines and principles on the conduct of democratic elections will not be fully adhered ahead of, during, and after the 2023 poll. So as a result, Zimbabweans will not fully enjoy media freedom. Their right to freedom of expression, assembly, association, and access to information. And further, the continued failure of the state broadcaster and newspapers to provide equal access to the political players makes competing environments uneven, resulting in dispute on the credibility and fairness of the input elections. So freedom of information is critical and compliance with the Constitution. So this entails, amongst other things, that the media is entitled to investigate and report critically on the efficiency and probity of the election administration. This is aptly provided for under Section 61 and 62 of the Constitution. Section 61 provides for freedom of expression and freedom of the media, while Section 62 provides for access to information. So our policy recommendations for the SADC community, which we have referred to earlier, as well as the AU and the international community, is firstly, all necessary measures should be taken to guarantee the safety and security of journalists. That deals with one of that we indicated has actually plagued the 2013 and the 2018 elections. The next thing would be to implement quality law reform and liberalization of the broadcasting sector in line with regional best practices. Next is to ensure that cybersecurity regulation is informed by the revised principles of the AC, HPR Declaration on Freedom of Expression, access to information, which recognizes the internet as a fundamental right. And the other thing is to take a stand against ongoing process by the ruling party of mutilating the Constitution, and that Zimbabwe should be able to focus on aligning the repressive laws with the expansive Bill of Rights. So That is also coupled with about 6 policy recommendations that we've cited for party. So the first one is that ZEC must set clear monitoring mechanisms and sanctions for non-compliance to ensure that state media complies with other public service mandates. The second one is that ZEC should widen the composition of the Media Monitoring Committee to include media stakeholders as a means of promoting transparency and accountability. The committee faces capacity challenges to effectively monitor and produce comprehensive reports on the state of the media coverage and performance during the election. So currently, ZEC relies on the ZMC, the Zimbabwe Media Commission, and the Broadcasting Authority of Zimbabwe in the discharge of this overwhelming duty. So there's a need to broaden the composition to include civil society and other stakeholders as a means of building capacity and ensuring transparency and accountability in that regard. Next, ZEC should widely publicize monitoring mechanisms and measures to ensure equal and equitable access to the public media, as well as guarding against the skewing of hate language in media, especially by the public media. ZEC must also demand a coverage schedule from the public broadcaster based on contesting parties, assess its fairness, approve and monitor the implementation that will follow. ZEC and ZMC should also ensure that authorities comply with the Constitution as it relates to securing the editorial independence and impartiality of state media. And the next would be that ZEC, in partnership with the ZMC, should review the code of conduct governing media during elections in consultation with the media stakeholders. As indicated by Thabani earlier, once an election has been declared, then ZEC should take over. But what would be for ZEC to work in partnership with ZMC, because it has that institutional capacity to do so. And then lastly, ZBC must establish clear public complaints mechanisms to address public concerns and to address them and act on them.
Okay, Thabani, I want to focus on the last point that Julian has highlighted, the issue of ZBC and any public media. We always talk about ZBC as a public media, it's funded by public money. But as MISA, do you think, what makes it so difficult for ZBC to actually become a public broadcaster?
Well, there are too many vested interests in ZBC, specifically from the ruling party, which is conflicted to the government. And with that, it brings numerous complexities. Where in ZBC, in its current state, has got numerous challenges, as seen by the KPMG report of 2015, which, among other things, had issues of fraud that were linked to the broadcaster, poor corporate governance. And what ZBC is facing now is a viability challenge, but also a governance challenge. So for it to function properly, firstly, there's need to ensure that the board is independent. Wherein the board is present at ZBC, but it doesn't make decisions. The minister makes decisions, including the recruitment of top-level management is from the ministry. When you have that, more of incest between ZBC and the ministry, chances are high that because the ministry is a ruling party-led government, that issues of the ruling party takes dominance in terms of the content, in terms of the programming. So what ZBC faces is a serious existential challenge. Firstly, there's need to build capacity of ZBC. Secondly, there's need to establish independence of ZBC. Then thirdly, once that is established, you recapitalize ZBC so that it moves from the current said state of being a state broadcaster into a public service. Public service would then need to have an independent body that reports to Parliament, because Parliament is the representative fora for our diversity as a people. And once this happens, you start seeing ZBC being able to compete. You see, they are setting ZBC up for failure. Currently, it has a single spectrum, which it is failing to fill with content. Now they've given it a second one in terms of television broadcasting ahead of private sector competition. Now, how do you feel in quality programming when you're failing to fill the current analog one? And now you give them a digital platform. Simply put, can you envisage a situation whereby someone will contemplate watching ZBC compared to DSTV? Someone will contemplate watching ZBC compared to going on their smartphone and tuning into YouTube. This is the state of competition. Many things have changed that ZBC should also equally change to meet the changing tastes of the peoples of Zimbabwe. In the current state, ZBC has got poor level of programming. It has limited reach. It is poorly staffed. Its equipment is obsolete, mainly depending on analog type of machinery. It confuses news, advertorials, and propaganda intertwined in one. And in one moment, you don't know whether you are seeing as a ruling party advertorial, or it is news, or there's no clear distinction. So when you have such a compromised state broadcaster pretending to be a public service, then you realize that it can't be facing the truth, that you honestly need to assess it, build structures of governance, recapitalize it. Why? Because if you pour money in the current state, you are simply developing efficiency in the churning out of propaganda. So there's need for that deliberate approach in terms of assessing ZBC. So that ZBC belongs to the people of Zimbabwe. It is controlled by an independent body. Its quality of programming is reflective of, and then above all, it then becomes transparent in terms of publishing audited statements, and that it starts a strong awareness drive so that the people regain trust of the ZBC as a public service. But in the current state, no one will take ZBC seriously because it doesn't behave in a manner that requires anyone to take it seriously. Mr. Zenzele Ndebele. I think Zenzele is hibernating. So Julian, I think in the interest of looking for Mr. Ndebele, I think my next question, jumping from being an interviewee to an interviewer, since I'm a journalist, I will utilize that. I wanted to check that.
Well.
Yeah, I wanted to check if ERC is going to widely, does he have an engagement strategy around this public policy brief, and how it is going to utilize it?
Presently, with the public policy brief, we usually send information out, which will be available in terms of even the paper itself. So that will be accessible to all stakeholders, and on our website as well. We should be able to publish that so that people can interface with it. We have Elect Talk that we have on radio regularly. So even in Elect Talk, we'll be able to speak about the policy brief in greater detail, and people can interface. Now that it's there, people can discuss it more. I know Kubatana is also another channel that disseminates a number of our policy papers, and that is also another avenue where people will be able to interface with our policy brief, as well as be informed and to engage even further, because ERC is not an island, and it's always good to also have the electorate give you their input after they've had a look at the policy brief and come up even with recommendations that might not have been included in the policy brief, because a lot of the issues you'll find affects the electorate themselves, and once they're given a platform, you get a perspective. So I'm not sure on your end as MISA how you will also go about it, if you have a strategy in place to ensure that the electorates and the stakeholders, not only the electorate, can also interface with policy.
Thabani can go ahead and come in, Thabani.
Thanks, Zenzele. I had stepped into your shoes due to technological glitches that had happened.
Yeah, it looks like the technology was not doing well there, so I'd been kicked out of the conversation.
So indeed. As you highlight, Julian, it is critical that the brief gains traction, and from what you're asking us as MISA, we are very keen in also equally distributing on our platforms, through our website, through our social media platforms, but we also engage a wider audience through various meetings, which upon the production and design of the policy, we are equally happy to utilize our various platforms to ensure that it is part of the conversations as we build up to the next general election, not only the 2023 ones, but including by-elections and those that are imminent. So it is key as a tool for us to engage in high-level type of advocacy and awareness on the part of the citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Thabani, for coming. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we always talk about is an access. I mean, if some of us who are in urban areas are actually facing challenges with, the technology, what about people in the rural areas? And this is the reason why the government should take serious the issue of community radio stations, because radios will then be accessible to everyone. We cannot, the cost of data itself makes that a lot of people are excluded from such conversations. These days, data is so expensive, and it is actually important that organizations like ERC are lobbying government and actually giving it policy options to say, guys, the liberalization of the airwaves should be a priority. Access to information should be a priority, because the majority of our people live in rural areas. They don't have access to internet, and therefore they need to have the issue of radios. And lastly, Julian, what would be your advice, or what's your parting word to government when it comes to such serious matters?
My parting shot to government is that its first obligation, first and foremost, is to uphold the Constitution, like I referred to earlier, through ensuring that the electoral environment is determined and is in compliance with the provisions of the law, as provided for domestically through the Constitution. So the set of guidelines and principles on the conduct of democratic elections in the Southern African region and the Electoral Act are instructive in formulating policies that will address problems of the past. So they provide for equitable treatment of all political parties and candidates in their extent, timing, prominence, and coverage accorded to all of them. So a clear distinction between factual reporting and editorial commenting on the election would be key, and the affording of a right to reply to any claims by the political parties or candidates concerned to be false that the media does not promote political parties or candidates that encourage violence and hatred against any class of persons in Zimbabwe. So in addition to that, the review of the media regulatory environment and the performance of the same should therefore then be regulated and guided by the regional and continental instruments, some of which we referred to earlier, which includes the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Government, Information in Africa, amongst other things. So that alone and its compliance with the law will certainly provide for not only an even playing field for all political actors concerned, but will also speak towards credible elections. And I believe that if the government is able to get seriously, then certainly there will be a change in the 2023 election, and we will be able to overcome the 5 challenges that we had faced in the 2013 and the 2018 election.
Okay, Thabani is the body that looks at media and all these kind of things, and probably one of the issues that are of concern is the safety of journalists. We've seen the arrest of Hopewell. You've told us that during COVID, almost 33 journalists were either arrested or harassed. Do you see any improvement?
Thanks, Zenzele. I think the issue of harassments and targeting of the media is quite unfortunate. And in our view, what we need to end is the impunity that is associated with these, wanton acts of harassments, detentions, attacks, among others. It's unheard of in 21st century that journalists who will be covering a press conference are attacked by people who are putting on masks. It's in the case of the Impala press conference in Harare. It's totally uncalled for in 21st century, existence. And in our view, that the government has an obligation to ensure the safety of all persons in Zimbabwe. And for journalists as a top priority, because it's a constitutionally provided for craft and science. So we call upon the government to ensure that there are clear safety nets, and that the government takes bold steps of sending a message to the perpetrators through, taking corrective measures whenever an attack or an assault happens. What we are seeing at the moment is that of all these 33 acts or attacks, there is no corresponding response from the government in holding the culprits to account. And then secondly, you spoke, Zenzele, to the issue of access to information during any given national process like an election. And we are seeing that the government have got a poor strategy in terms of access to information through internet, wherein they are focusing on the white elephants, the former post office of infrastructure, and building what they are calling community information centers or something like that effect. This is a wrong strategy. What they need to do is to utilize the Universal Services Fund to build the enabling infrastructure in terms of boosters and base stations, so that universal access to the internet is more accessible beyond the radius of urban centers, but to go where the private entities do not see profit and establish infrastructure, so that when you go to the next election, the mobile internet will become the hotspot of accessing information at any given time. So it is a key issue to us that the government really look at its own strategy and change it. Then the issue you mentioned, Zenzele, of liberalization of the airwaves, the government should not continue to be seen to be giving itself licenses the way they are doing with community radio stations, that the government will be the beneficiary of the license they've called for. That's so wrong, because communities have been gone for all these years waiting for a license only for the government to license itself. The strategy is, Zenzele, without blinking, the government has invited community radio stations through identified geographical areas where the government has already done contact awareness programs. And you know that government through National FM, which is a languages station, has content through ZBC, which they are going to pass out to these so-called new community radio initiatives that they are licensing. So they will be decentralizing content for ZBC rather than licensing genuine communities for our existence. And this is so wrong and criminal. And then the other tier of private broadcasters, you see who are big, they are the shortlisted of the 14. Some of them are already government officials, some of them are in the security services. There's no genuine openness in terms of new voices being given an opportunity. So we want a broader strategy that allows for the opening of access to information, and that will allow for responsive electoral management in our lifetime. Thank you, Zenzele.
Okay, thank you very much, Thabani, who's the director of MISA Zimbabwe, and Julian, who is the ERC board member. We're talking about one of the most important issues, the state of media in Zimbabwe vis-a-vis the elections, where ERC was giving us, or launching a policy brief that actually looking at these issues. And I think we can get this document, read about it, and try and understand. There are quite interesting points that are raised in this policy brief, because it gives us an idea, it gives us a picture of the state of media in Zimbabwe, and probably the reason why we normally don't get the coverage that we want during elections. And we hope that the government will align the laws that we have, but also try by all means to make sure that our communities have access to information and the media is diversified. State broadcasters or public broadcasters are supposed to actually serve the people and not the politicians. decisions. And I like to thank those who were following us, and you can still watch the program. It's available, but also you can go on ERC platforms, Facebook, Twitter, the website, and try and get this document to understand. My name is Zenzele Ndebele. This was the Breakfast Club. Till we meet again in other programs, have a good day.